May 15, 2024. 7:23 a.m. This single boot would unlock a mystery that had haunted Utah for nearly 3 decades. Inside it, the remains of a human foot. But whose foot? And how did it end up on the remote shores of Fish Lake? Miles from any road, any town, any hope of rescue. The answer would bring a mother to her knees in tears. It would give 3 daughters the closure they'd prayed for since they were young women. And it would solve a case that had consumed investigators, search teams, and an entire community for 28 long years. What you're about to hear is the true story of a father who kissed his wife goodbye on a September morning in 1997, promising to be home by Sunday dinner. A man who had fished these waters for 20 years, who knew every cove, every current, every danger. A man who simply vanished. The discovery came from an unlikely source. Marcus Thompson, a retired park ranger, was taking his morning walk with his dog when Rex started barking frantically at something half buried in the sand. Marcus had seen a lot in his 30 years patrolling Utah's wilderness, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to uncover. Inside that boot were the answers a family had been searching for since Bill Clinton was president. Since before Google existed. Since before cell phones could take pictures or GPS could guide you home. This was a mystery from a different time, when a man could disappear without a trace and leave behind only questions that seemed impossible to answer. September 15, 1997. David White was 49 years old, a construction foreman from Washington, Utah. He was a husband, a father of 3 daughters, and a fisherman who treated every cast like a prayer. That morning, he launched his boat into Fish Lake just as the sun painted the water gold. By sunset, his boat was found drifting empty across the lake. David was gone. His wife Patricia waited by the phone for a call that never came. His daughters, Stephanie, Rebecca, and Jennifer, drove through the night to join a search that would consume 5 days and 50 volunteers. They found his hat floating in the water. They found one of his shoes, but they never found David. For 28 years, the White family lived in a special kind of hell, not knowing if David was alive or dead, not knowing if they should grieve or keep hoping, not knowing if he had suffered, if he had called out for help, if he had thought of them in his final moments. They returned to Fish Lake every year on the anniversary of his disappearance. They posted flyers, organized searches, followed leads that led nowhere. Patricia's hair turned gray, then white. The daughters grew up, got married, had children of their own. But they never stopped looking for their father. And then, on a quiet spring morning in 2024, a dog's bark changed everything. What Marcus Thompson found that day would prove that sometimes the wilderness keeps its secrets for decades before deciding to give them back. Sometimes answers come when you least expect them, carried by currents you can't see, preserved by forces you can't understand. This is the story of what happened to David White. It's a story about the power of a father's love, the strength of a family's faith, and the way hope can survive even when everything else seems lost. It's about the moment when 28 years of questions finally found their answer in a hiking boot on a lonely shore. But to understand how that boot ended up on the shores of Fish Lake, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to September 1997, when David White made a decision that would change his family's life forever. Back to the morning when an experienced fisherman set out on familiar waters and never came home. David Michael White wasn't the kind of man who took unnecessary risks. Born on March 12, 1948, in the small town of Washington, Utah, David learned early that hard work and careful planning were the keys to providing for the people you love. At 49, his hands told the story of a man who had built his life one honest day at a time. As a construction foreman for Red Rock Building Company, David managed crews across southern Utah's booming construction market. His reputation was built on 2 things: he never missed a deadline, and he never lost a worker to carelessness. Safety wasn't just a company policy for David White. It was personal. But it was away from the construction sites where David truly came alive. Every weekend that weather permitted, you'd find him on Utah's lakes and rivers with his 3 daughters. Stephanie, the eldest at 28, had inherited her father's patience and precision. Rebecca, 25, shared his quiet strength. Jennifer, the baby at 22, had his adventurous spirit and stubborn determination. Patricia and White had been David's anchor since their high school days at Dixie High School. Married for 26 years by September 1997, she knew her husband's rhythms better than anyone. She knew he hummed old country songs when he was content. She knew he got quiet when work stress was building. And she knew that fishing wasn't just David's hobby, it was his therapy. David approached fishing the same way he approached construction, with methodical preparation and deep respect for the forces he was working with. His tackle box was a masterpiece of organization. Every lure had its place, every hook was sharpened, every line was tested. Friends joked that David's fishing gear was cleaner than most people's kitchens. For over 20 years, David had been reading Utah's waters like a favorite book. He knew that fish lakes trout moved to deeper waters when storm fronts approached. He understood that early morning mist meant the fish would be feeding near the surface. He could predict weather changes by watching how the water moved against the shoreline. The fishing trip to Fish Lake had been planned since early summer. David, along with his longtime friends Robert Bobby Henderson and Michael Torres, had been making this annual pilgrimage for 8 years running. It was their tradition, 3 days of fishing, storytelling, and the kind of friendship that only comes from shared silence on quiet water. Bobby Henderson had worked alongside David for 15 years. They'd framed houses together, poured foundations in 100-degree heat, and trusted each other with their lives on dangerous job sites. Michael Torres was the storyteller of the group, a man who could make even the worst fishing day feel like an adventure worth remembering. Tuesday, September 9th, 1997, 6:15 p.m. The first call came from Bobby. The Riverside Shopping Center project was behind schedule, and the general contractor was threatening penalties that could bankrupt Bobby's small company. He couldn't leave his crew, not even for 3 days. Thursday, September 11th, 1997, 11:30 p.m. Michael's call woke David from a deep sleep. His wife Carmen had gone into labor 6 weeks early with their second child. Michael was at the hospital, scared and exhausted, watching his premature son fight for every breath in the neonatal intensive care unit. Most men would have canceled the trip, rescheduled for a time when everyone could go. But David had been carrying the weight of a particularly brutal construction season. 3 major projects running simultaneously, crews working overtime, and the constant pressure of keeping dozens of families employed in an uncertain economy. Patricia found David in the garage at midnight on September 12th, methodically checking his fishing equipment for the 3rd time that week. She'd seen this before. The way David's shoulders carried tension like a physical burden. The way he got quiet when the stress was building to dangerous levels. September 13th, 1997, Saturday morning. Patricia made David's favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with cheese, thick-cut bacon, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She watched him eat in silence, knowing that her husband was wrestling with a decision that went deeper than just a fishing trip. Patricia had learned not to argue with David when his mind was made up, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the way he held her a little longer when he kissed her goodbye. Maybe it was how he looked back at the house twice before getting in his truck. Or maybe it was just a wife's intuition that something was about to change forever. Sunday, September 14th, 1997, 3:45 p.m. David White left Washington, Utah, for what should have been a routine 2.5-hour drive to Fish Lake. His truck was loaded with enough gear for 3 men, but he was making the journey alone. The radio played classic country as he drove through the desert landscape, past red rock formations that had watched over travelers for thousands of years. David pulled into the gravel parking lot of Lakeside Lodge, a family-owned motel that had been catering to fishermen and hunters since the 1960s. The desk clerk that day was Janet Morrison, a local woman whose own father had taught her to fish on these same waters 40 years earlier. Janet remembered David immediately, not because he was unusual, but because he was so thoroughly prepared. While other guests asked about restaurants and entertainment, David wanted to know about water temperature, recent weather patterns, and which areas of the lake had been producing the best catches. Room 12 became David's base camp for what he hoped would be 3 days of solitude and successful fishing. He spent nearly an hour organizing his gear, laying out rods, checking reels, and studying topographical maps of the lake. This wasn't obsession. This was the careful preparation of a man who understood that details could mean the difference between success and failure. David called Patricia to let her know he'd arrived safely. She could hear the exhaustion in his voice, but also something else. A quiet anticipation that told her this trip meant more to him than just catching fish. They talked for 20 minutes about everything and nothing, the comfortable conversation of two people who had shared a lifetime together. Before turning in for the night, David walked down to the lake shore. The water was glass smooth, reflecting the first stars of evening. He stood there for a long time, listening to the gentle lap of water against the rocks, feeling the stress of the past months beginning to lift from his shoulders. Monday, September 15th, 1997, 5:45 a.m. David arrived at Pete's Marina as the sun was painting the eastern mountains gold. Pete Kowalski had been renting boats to Fisherman for 22 years, and he prided himself on reading his customers. David White impressed him immediately. Pete watched David inspect the 16-foot aluminum boat with the thoroughness of a man who understood that water doesn't forgive carelessness. David checked the engine, tested the steering, examined every piece of safety equipment. He asked intelligent questions about the boat's handling characteristics and fuel consumption. The boat David rented was perfect for Fish Lake's conditions. Stable, reliable, and equipped with everything a serious fisherman needed. David loaded his 3 fishing rods, 2 tackle boxes, a cooler packed with sandwiches and cold drinks, and his lucky fishing hat, a faded baseball cap that had been his companion on every fishing trip for the past decade. David started the engine and began his slow journey toward the northern end of Fish Lake, where the deeper water held the larger trout. Pete watched from the dock as David's boat disappeared into the morning mist, the sound of the engine fading to a gentle hum across the water. It was a perfect morning for fishing. The air was cool and still, the water calm as glass, and the overcast sky provided the kind of light that made fish active and eager to feed. David White was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he loved most. In a few hours, he would simply cease to exist. September 15th, 1997. The sun was starting its descent behind the Fish Lake Mountains, painting the water in shades of amber and gold. At Pete's Marina, the day's last fishermen were returning with their catches, sharing stories of the ones that got away. But one boat was still missing. Pete Kowalski stood on his dock, binoculars in hand, searching the water for any sign of David's boat. In 22 years of renting boats, Pete had developed an internal clock that told him when something wasn't right. David had promised to be back by sunset, and David struck Pete as the kind of man who kept his promises. Pete tried calling the Lakeside Lodge to see if David had returned early and forgotten to bring the boat back. Janet Morrison checked room 12. David's gear was still there, his bed unslept in. The truck was in the parking lot, keys on the nightstand. David White had simply vanished. Pete made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. He and his 19-year-old son Tommy launched their own boat to search for David. Tommy had grown up on Fish Lake, knew every cove and inlet, every place a fisherman might seek shelter or run into trouble. They started at the northern end of the lake, where David had been heading that morning. Pete knew the good fishing spots, the places where an experienced angler would spend his day. They called David's name across the water, their voices echoing off the canyon walls, but only silence answered back. Tommy spotted it first, a dark shape moving slowly across the water about a mile from the main fishing area. As they got closer, Pete's worst fears were confirmed. It was David's rental boat, engines still running at trolling speed, but completely empty. What Pete and Tommy found defied explanation. The boat was in perfect fishing formation, trolling slowly with a line trailing behind it. David's tackle box was open, fresh bait still on the hooks. His thermos of coffee was still warm to the touch. It was as if David had simply stepped out of the boat mid-cast and vanished into thin air. But there were disturbing signs that something had gone terribly wrong. David's lucky fishing hat was floating about 50 yards away, waterlogged and heavy. One of his brown leather hiking boots bobbed in the water nearby. The boat showed no signs of struggle, no damage, no indication of what had happened to its occupant. Pete's voice crackled over the marine radio to the Coast Guard station in Salt Lake City. "This is Pete's Marina on Fish Lake. We have a missing fisherman. Boat found empty, engine running, personal effects in the water. We need immediate assistance." Meanwhile, 150 miles south in Washington, Utah, Patricia White was pacing her kitchen floor. David had promised to call when he reached the lake safely. When evening came without word, Patricia knew something was wrong. David was many things, but unreliable wasn't one of them. Patricia's call to the Sevier County Sheriff's Office was logged at exactly 10:32 p.m. Deputy Nathan Curtis, working the night shift, took the call. Patricia's voice was steady but strained as she reported her husband missing. She gave Curtis a detailed description of David, his vehicle, and his planned activities. Curtis immediately connected Patricia's missing person report with Pete's earlier call about the abandoned boat. This wasn't just a fisherman who had lost track of time. This was a potential tragedy unfolding on one of Utah's most remote lakes. Tuesday, September 16, 1997, 4:30 a.m. As the first gray light of dawn touched the Fish Lake Mountains, search and rescue teams from 3 counties were converging on Fish Lake. What began as a routine missing person case was rapidly becoming one of the largest search operations in Utah history. Deputy Nathan Curtis found himself coordinating a search effort unlike anything he'd experienced in his 5 years with the sheriff's office. By sunrise, over 50 volunteers had arrived at Fish Lake, experienced search and rescue personnel, local fishermen who knew the water, and concerned citizens who simply wanted to help find David White. The search was methodical and comprehensive. 3 dive teams from Salt Lake City brought specialized equipment to explore the deeper sections of Fish Lake. 2 helicopters from the Utah National Guard provided aerial reconnaissance. Search dogs from the state police tracked scent trails along the shoreline. Wednesday, September 17, 1997, 10:15 a.m. Patricia White arrived at Fish Lake with her 3 daughters. Stephanie had driven through the night from her home in Provo. Rebecca had left her job at a Salt Lake City bank without explanation. Jennifer had abandoned her college classes at Southern Utah University. The White family was together, united in their desperate hope. The White women refused to be passive observers in their own tragedy. Stephanie joined the shoreline search teams, her methodical nature perfectly suited to the careful examination of every cove and inlet. Rebecca worked with the volunteer coordinators, organizing food and supplies for the searchers. Jennifer, despite being the youngest, insisted on joining the boat crews searching the open water. Search teams interviewed every person who had been at Fish Lake over the weekend. Other fishermen, campers, hikers, marina employees, everyone was asked the same crucial questions. Had they seen David White? Had they noticed anything unusual? Had they heard any calls for help? But the answers were always the same. No one had seen David after he left Pete's Marina that Monday morning. No one had heard any distress calls or sounds of trouble. No one had witnessed any kind of accident or emergency. It was as if David White had simply evaporated into the morning mist. The dive teams worked in shifts, exploring every section of Fish Lake's bottom where David might have fallen in. Fish Lake reaches depths of over 100 feet in some areas, with underwater rock formations and fallen trees that could trap a body. But after 3 days of intensive diving, they found nothing. Thursday, September 18, 1997, evening. Patricia stood on the same dock where her husband had launched his boat just 4 days earlier. The search teams had covered hundreds of square miles of water and shoreline. They had followed every lead, explored every possibility, interviewed every potential witness. Friday, September 19, 1997, 6 p.m. After 5 days of intensive searching, Sheriff Curtis made one of the most difficult decisions of his career. With no new leads and resources stretched to their limits, the official search for David White was being scaled back to a recovery operation. The White family watched from the shore as the search boats returned to Pete's Marina one final time. 50 volunteers, 3 dive teams, 2 helicopters, and countless hours of searching had yielded only questions. David White had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Stephanie White, speaking for her family, thanked every volunteer who had given their time and energy to finding her father. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she promised that the family would never stop looking, never stop hoping, never stop believing that David White would come home. As the sun set on September 19, 1997, the official search for David White came to an end. But for his family, this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a journey that would test their faith, their strength, and their love for 28 long years. October 15, 1997. 1 month after David's disappearance, Detective Maria Santos was assigned to what had officially become a cold case. At 38 years old, Maria had 15 years of experience with missing persons investigations, but David White's case was unlike anything in her files. Maria spread the case files across her desk like pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. Witness statements that led nowhere. Physical evidence that raised more questions than answers. A missing man who had simply stepped out of his life without leaving a single clue about where he had gone. As the snow melted and Fish Lake became accessible again, Detective Santos organized a new search using advanced sonar equipment. The technology could map the lake bottom in detail, revealing objects that divers might have missed in the murky depths. The sonar revealed Fish Lake's hidden geography, underwater cliffs, submerged trees, and rock formations that created a maze beneath the surface. If David had drowned, his body could have been trapped in any number of underwater caves or crevices, hidden from even the most experienced divers. For Patricia White, the transition from active search to cold case investigation was devastating. The house that had once been filled with David's laughter now echoed with silence. His coffee cup still sat in the kitchen sink where she'd left it, unwashed, as if keeping it dirty might somehow bring him home. Each of David's daughters found their own way to cope with the unbearable uncertainty. Stephanie channeled her grief into action, becoming a volunteer coordinator for the Utah Missing Persons Network. She organized annual searches, maintained contact with law enforcement, and refused to let her father's case fade into bureaucratic obscurity. Rebecca found solace in her faith, spending hours in prayer at the small Mormon church where she and David had attended services together. She believed that God had a plan, that her father's disappearance served some greater purpose that would eventually be revealed. Jennifer, the youngest, struggled with anger that seemed to have no target. She was furious with her father for going alone, with the authorities for not finding him, with a world that seemed to have forgotten David White ever existed. Her anger was really grief in disguise, but it would take years for her to understand that. As the years passed, the White family developed a ritual that became both their salvation and their torment. Every September 15th, they returned to Fish Lake. They would spend the weekend searching areas that hadn't been covered before, posting new flyers, talking to anyone who would listen. The missing person flyers became a familiar sight throughout Utah. David's face stared out from gas station bulletin boards, post office walls, and truck stop message centers. "Have you seen this man?" the posters asked, but the answer was always the same devastating silence. March 12, 2001. Patricia's phone rang at 2:30 in the afternoon. A construction worker in Las Vegas claimed he'd been working alongside a man who looked exactly like David White. The man had the same build, the same weathered hands, the same quiet way of speaking. Patricia and Stephanie drove through the night to Las Vegas, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. What if it was David? What if he had amnesia, or had been injured and couldn't remember his family? What if he had chosen to disappear and didn't want to be found? The man in Las Vegas was named Robert Martinez. He was the same age as David, had similar features, and worked in construction. But he wasn't David White. He had his own family, his own life, his own story. Patricia and Stephanie drove home in crushing silence. Another false hope added to their collection of heartbreak. Over the next decade, there would be dozens of similar calls. David White had been spotted working construction in Colorado. A fisherman in Arizona looked familiar. A homeless man in Phoenix might have been David. Each report sent family members racing across state lines, following leads that inevitably led nowhere. The constant cycle of hope and disappointment took a physical toll on Patricia. By 2005, her doctor was prescribing medication for anxiety and depression. She had developed chronic insomnia, lying awake at night wondering if David was somewhere out there, wondering if he was trying to come home. Detective Santos worked the David White case for over a decade, following up on every lead no matter how unlikely. She interviewed hundreds of people, consulted with experts from other states, and tried new search techniques as they became available. But the lake kept its secrets. 2005 brought new hope in the form of advanced technology. Side-scan sonar could create detailed images of the lake bottom. Underwater cameras could explore areas too dangerous for divers. The Utah Department of Public Safety committed resources to a comprehensive re-examination of Fish Lake. The new sonar revealed several objects on Fish Lake's bottom that hadn't been detected in previous searches. Each discovery sent dive teams back into the water, hoping that this time they would find the answers the White family desperately needed. But each object turned out to be debris, old fishing equipment lost by other anglers, fallen trees, natural rock formations. The lake bottom held many secrets, but none of them belonged to David White. December 2008. Patricia White was rushed to Dixie Regional Medical Center with chest pains that doctors initially feared might be a heart attack. The stress of 11 years without answers had taken a severe toll on her health. As her daughters gathered around her hospital bed, they faced a terrifying possibility. Their mother might die without ever knowing what happened to their father. By 2010, Nathan Curtis had been promoted to sheriff of Sevier County. The David White case had followed him through his entire career, a constant reminder of the limitations of law enforcement and the persistence of unanswered questions. As the years passed, new missing persons cases demanded attention and resources. The original investigators retired or moved to other assignments. The David White case was transferred from detective to detective, each one inheriting a file full of dead ends and frustrated hopes. But the White family never stopped searching. Every September 15th, they returned to Fish Lake like pilgrims to a shrine. Patricia, now using a walker, would stand on the same dock where David had launched his boat. Stephanie, Rebecca, and Jennifer, now middle-aged women with families of their own, would organize new search efforts with whatever volunteers they could find. A new generation joined the search as David's grandchildren grew old enough to understand their family's tragedy. Children who had never met their grandfather helped post flyers and distribute information, keeping David's memory alive for people who had never known him. By 2020, Patricia White was 75 years old and battling serious health issues. Her daughters worried that their mother might not live to see the answers she had prayed for since 1997. But Patricia's faith never wavered. She believed that someday, somehow, David would come home. 23 years had passed since David White disappeared. A generation of law enforcement officers had worked his case. Thousands of volunteer hours had been spent searching for him. Advanced technology had mapped every inch of Fish Lake's bottom. But the questions remained as haunting as ever. What happened to David White? And would his family ever know the truth? The David White case was moved to long-term storage, but it was never officially closed. In law enforcement, there's a saying that missing persons cases are never really cold. They're just waiting for the right piece of evidence to bring them back to life. For the White family, that evidence was still out there somewhere, waiting to be discovered. May 16, 2024, 8:30 a.m. The Utah State Crime Laboratory in Salt Lake City received what appeared to be routine evidence from a missing person case. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic anthropologist with 23 years of experience, was assigned to examine the remains found by Marcus Thompson and his dog Rex. Dr. Mitchell had seen thousands of cases involving human remains, but something about this particular boot caught her attention immediately. The leather was weathered but remarkably well preserved. More importantly, the sole bore distinctive markings that would prove crucial to solving a mystery that had haunted Utah for nearly 3 decades. The sole of the boot displayed a clear manufacturer's logo and model number, Timberland TB 4429. Dr. Mitchell had learned over the years that seemingly insignificant details often held the keys to major breakthroughs. She immediately began researching the boot's manufacturing history. What Dr. Mitchell discovered would change everything. The Timberland TB 4429 wasn't just any hiking boot. It was manufactured for exactly 11 months, from March through December 1996. The model was discontinued due to a design flaw in the sole that caused premature separation from the upper leather. May 17, 2024, 10:15 a.m. Dr. Mitchell's call to Timberland's corporate headquarters confirmed her research. Only 9,847 pairs of the TB 4429 were ever manufactured. They were sold exclusively through specialty outdoor retailers, primarily in the western United States. Anyone wearing these boots in 1997 would have purchased them during that specific 11-month window. Dr. Mitchell had worked enough missing persons cases to recognize when she was holding evidence that could change lives forever. Her call to Sheriff Nathan Curtis at 2:45 p.m. on May 17th would finally provide answers to questions that had tormented a family for 28 years. Sheriff Curtis had been waiting for this call his entire career. When Dr. Mitchell described the boot model and manufacturing dates, Curtis immediately pulled the David White case file. His hands moved with practiced efficiency to the evidence inventory completed by Patricia White in September 1997. There it was, written in Patricia White's careful handwriting. Brown leather Timberland hiking boots, model TB 4429, size 10.5, purchased at Zion Outfitters, St. George, Utah, July 1996. The match was too specific, too precise to be coincidental. But Sheriff Curtis needed more than circumstantial evidence. Curtis had carried the David White case through his entire career. He had been a young deputy when David disappeared, full of confidence that modern law enforcement could solve any mystery. Now, approaching retirement, he understood that some questions take decades to answer. May 18, 2024, 4:20 p.m. Sheriff Curtis made one of the most important phone calls of his 30-year career. Stephanie Bennett was at her office in Provo when her phone rang. She had received calls from law enforcement dozens of times over the years, and each one had ended in disappointment. But this call was different. Sheriff Curtis's voice carried a weight that Stephanie had never heard before. When he began describing the boot, the manufacturing dates, the specific model number, Stephanie felt something she hadn't experienced in 28 years, genuine hope. Stephanie had become an expert on her father's case over the decades. She knew every detail, every piece of evidence, every failed lead. When Curtis mentioned the Timberland TB 4429, she didn't need to check her records. She remembered her mother describing those exact boots to investigators in 1997. Curtis explained that while the boot evidence was compelling, they needed DNA confirmation to definitively identify the remains. Would Stephanie be willing to provide a sample for comparison? After 28 years of waiting, Stephanie didn't hesitate for even a moment. May 18, 2024, 6:45 p.m. Stephanie's first call was to her sister Rebecca in Salt Lake City. Rebecca was preparing dinner for her family when the phone rang. When Stephanie began explaining about the boot, Rebecca had to sit down. After nearly 3 decades of false hopes, could this finally be the answer they had prayed for? Jennifer, now living in Las Vegas with her own family, received Stephanie's call with the skepticism that comes from too many disappointments. But as Stephanie described the specific details, the boot model, the manufacturing dates, the perfect match with their father's description, Jennifer felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crack. May 20, 2024, 9 a.m. The 3 White sisters met at the Utah Department of Health's DNA collection facility in Salt Lake City. They hadn't been together in the same room since their mother's last birthday celebration. The gravity of the moment was overwhelming. The DNA collection process took less than 5 minutes. A simple cheek swab that would either confirm their worst fears or finally provide the closure they had sought for 28 years. The sample would be sent to the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, where it would be compared to genetic material extracted from the remains. May 20, 2024, 2:30 p.m. The sisters drove together to visit their mother at the assisted living facility where Patricia had been living since her health declined. At 78, Patricia was battling multiple health issues, but her mind remained sharp and her faith unshaken. When her daughters told Patricia about the boot discovery, the elderly woman began to cry. These weren't tears of sadness, but tears of relief mixed with a grief that had been held in check for 28 years. Patricia had always believed that someday David would come home. She just hadn't expected it to take so long. The wait for DNA results was scheduled to take 2 weeks. For a family that had waited 28 years for answers, 14 days felt like an eternity. Each morning brought the possibility that this might be the day they finally learned the truth about David White's fate. At the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico, Dr. James Rodriguez was conducting one of the most important DNA analyses of his career. The genetic material extracted from the remains was degraded, as expected after 28 years of exposure to the elements, but there was enough viable DNA to conduct a meaningful comparison. The DNA analysis process required multiple tests to ensure accuracy. Dr. Rodriguez had to extract genetic material from bone fragments found within the boot, amplify the DNA using specialized techniques, and compare it to Stephanie Bennett's reference sample. May 30, 2024, 3:15 p.m. Dr. Rodriguez completed his preliminary analysis. The results were promising, but he wanted to run additional tests to eliminate any possibility of error. This was a case that would bring closure to a family that had waited nearly 3 decades for answers. June 3, 2024, 2:30 p.m. Dr. Rodriguez's call to Sheriff Curtis was brief and definitive. The DNA analysis showed a 99.9994% probability that the remains found in the hiking boot belonged to a biological relative of Stephanie Bennett. After 28 years of uncertainty, science had provided the answer. Sheriff Curtis sat in his office for several minutes before making the call that would change the White family's life forever. He had delivered difficult news to families many times over his career, but this was different. This was the end of a journey that had lasted nearly 3 decades. June 3, 2024, 3:45 p.m. Stephanie Bennett was reviewing quarterly reports at her office when Sheriff Curtis called. When he said the words, "We have a match," Stephanie felt 28 years of carefully controlled emotions break free like water through a cracked dam. Through tears, Stephanie called Rebecca and Jennifer, the 3 sisters who had spent their adult lives wondering what happened to their father finally had their answer. David White had been found. After 28 years, he was coming home. The sisters drove immediately to their mother's assisted living facility. Patricia White, the woman who had never stopped believing, who had never given up hope, who had waited 28 years for this moment, finally had the answer to her prayers. Patricia's reaction was a mixture of overwhelming relief and profound grief. Relief that the uncertainty was finally over. Grief that her worst fears had been confirmed. But also gratitude that she had lived long enough to know the truth about what happened to the man she had loved for over 50 years. June 5, 2024, 10 a.m. The Sevier County Sheriff's Office conference room became the site of the final briefing on the David White case. Sheriff Curtis, Dr. Mitchell, and water current specialist Dr. Michael Rodriguez gathered to piece together the final chapter of a mystery that had lasted 28 years. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis revealed the remarkable journey that David's remains had taken over nearly 3 decades. Fish Lake's underwater geography creates complex current patterns that change dramatically with seasonal water levels. During spring snowmelt, currents can move objects several miles from their original location. The computer models showed that David's remains had likely been moved multiple times over the years. During high water periods, they would have been submerged and carried by underwater currents. During drought years, they might have been temporarily exposed on different shorelines, only to be submerged again when water levels rose. The hiking boot had acted as a natural preservation chamber, protecting the remains from scavengers and most environmental factors. The leather had created a sealed environment that allowed organic material to survive for 28 years in conditions that would normally cause complete decomposition within months. Based on all available evidence, investigators concluded that David White had most likely suffered an accidental drowning while fishing alone on September 15, 1997. The exact circumstances would never be known, but the evidence suggested he had fallen overboard while his boat was in trolling mode. The boat's engine had continued running at trolling speed after David fell in, explaining why Pete Kowalski and his son found it drifting unmanned across the lake. David's hat and shoe floating nearby indicated the approximate location where he had entered the water. June 8, 2024, 2 p.m. Stephanie Bennett stood before local media to make a statement on behalf of her family. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she held the paper containing words she had waited 28 years to speak. Marcus Thompson, the retired park ranger whose morning walk had solved a 28-year mystery, continued his daily hikes around Fish Lake. He told reporters that the experience had changed his perspective on the wilderness he had spent his career protecting. David White's disappearance had already led to significant changes in safety protocols at Fish Lake and other remote fishing areas throughout Utah. Pete's Marina now requires all boat renters to file detailed float plans and carry emergency communication devices. June 15, 2024. A memorial plaque was installed at Pete's Marina in David's honor. The bronze plaque, overlooking the same waters where David had launched his final fishing trip, serves as a reminder of both the beauty and the dangers of Utah's wilderness. The plaque reads, "In memory of David Michael White, 1948 to 1997, and all those who have found both peace and peril in these waters. May their stories remind us that preparation and caution are the price of enjoying nature's gifts." The White family's first visit to David's memorial was both heartbreaking and healing. For the first time in 28 years, they had a place to go to feel close to David. Not a grave, but a spot that honored his memory and his love for the outdoors. Patricia White, now 78 and in declining health, was able to visit the memorial with the help of her daughters. She placed her weathered hand on the bronze plaque and whispered words that only she and David would understand. For Sheriff Nathan Curtis, the resolution of the David White case marked the end of a journey that had spanned his entire career. From a young deputy taking the initial missing person report to the sheriff who finally brought David home, Curtis had carried this case for 28 years. June 20, 2024. The David White case file was officially closed and transferred to the archives. After 28 years, 10,220 days, and countless hours of investigation, the mystery was finally solved. June 25, 2024. David Michael White was finally laid to rest in the Washington City Cemetery, not far from the home where he had raised his 3 daughters. The funeral was attended by family, friends, and many of the volunteers who had searched for him over the years. Pete Kowalski, the marina owner who had rented David his final boat, attended the funeral despite his advanced age. Pete had carried guilt for 28 years, wondering if he could have done something different that September morning. David's funeral finally gave him peace. Stephanie, Rebecca, and Jennifer served as pallbearers for their father, a role they had imagined but never expected to fulfill after so many years. As they carried David's casket, they carried with them 28 years of love, loss, and unshakable faith. Fish Lake continues to attract fishermen and outdoor enthusiasts from across the country. The water that took David White's life also sustains countless species of fish and wildlife. It's a reminder that nature is neither good nor evil. It simply is. Today's visitors to Fish Lake benefit from the lessons learned from David White's tragedy. Improved safety protocols, better communication equipment, and increased awareness of the risks have made the lake safer for everyone who comes to enjoy its beauty. The White family's first Christmas after finding David was different from the 27 that had come before. There was still sadness, but it was the clean sadness of grief rather than the torment of uncertainty. They could finally mourn properly and begin to heal. Patricia White, the woman who had waited 28 years for answers, finally found peace in her final years. She could look at David's photos without wondering where he was or if he was suffering. She knew he was at rest. David White's story reminds us that the wilderness doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about your experience level, your preparation, or your family waiting at home. But his story also shows us the power of persistence, the strength of family bonds, and the importance of never abandoning hope. If this story has moved you, share it with someone who loves the outdoors. Your share could save a life. Tell people where you're going. Carry communication devices. Never go alone into remote areas, because the wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. The White family wants David's story to serve as both a warning and an inspiration. A warning about the real dangers that exist in our most beautiful places, and an inspiration to never give up hope, even when hope seems impossible to maintain. If you know someone dealing with a missing family member, let them know that answers can come after 28 years, carried by a hiker's dog on a quiet morning by a mountain lake. Subscribe for more true stories that matter, and remember, in the wilderness, preparation isn't just smart, it's survival. Because you never know when the mountains will decide to keep their secrets, or when they'll finally decide to give them back. This story is dedicated to David Michael White, to the family who never stopped looking for him, and to all those who are still waiting for their loved ones to come home. May their stories remind us that love transcends time, hope transcends despair, and sometimes, just sometimes, the wilderness gives back what it has taken.